These NBA players got paid a bag and then absolutely stunk it up. And we gotta start with everyone's least favorite podcaster. Everybody hates Paul George. I just made a video on PG and he's still the inspiration for this video, because after the research and the recording of my last video, this guy went out to drop 2 points, getting brutally outscored by Bronny James while Embiid and Maxey were on the sideline. And did I mention that this dude is getting paid over $500,000 per game? $50 million is what these 76ers thought that a 34-year-old podcast P was worth. This guy is a full-time podcaster. Since signing his Giga podcast deal, NBA contract, Podcast P has went out there and obliterated the podcast game, dropping 228 podcast clips compared to his 191 buckets made as of February 7th. This dude is dropping more content than Joe Rogan while dropping no buckets, having by far the worst season of his entire career. At 16 points on 42% from the field and 36% from three as a severely regressed defender, Paul George landing a $200 million contract with the Sixers was really just highway robbery. Paul Pinky George is sitting out of games for any reason he can think of. The latest being that his pinky hurts, as he would sit out and drop 2 hour-long podcasts in 3 days, then blast us with prize pick ad reads after making $1 million not playing basketball this week. Honestly, I could sit here and cook Podcast P for the next hour, but let's move on to Duncan Robinson. After a pretty cool rise to the top of the NBA, playing a very significant role on the finals run with the Heat in 2020, Robinson got himself a bag. This guy is and was pretty much just a shooter, but at nearly 45% from 3 in 2020 with 13 points per game, I don't really need to explain to you how much the NBA values him, because this landed Robinson a 5-year, $90 million deal. But after this point, we would see one of the quickest fall-offs I've ever seen, to where Miami wasn't even playing this guy anymore. What happened to Duncan Robinson? Well, when at his best, there was a few things to note about Robinson's play. Despite the sky-high shooting efficiency and the sky-high volume of three-pointers made, Duncan Robinson was a bit inconsistent. This sounds a little crazy, I know. How inconsistent can you be when half your 3 balls are dropping? But while the world was in love with him, they were quick to write off multiple big moments in which Robinson would completely disappear, because sooner or later he would bounce back to put up a whole lot of points in not too many possessions. When he was running off DHOs with Bam Adebayo, he could quickly turn and fire shots at a crazy high efficiency. But when he wasn't, this guy wasn't a threat to do literally anything else on the floor, while being a complete defensive liability that was heavily exploited and attacked in pick and rolls throughout the entire 2020 finals. As Robinson would slightly regress the following year, as closeouts got quicker, the 2021 playoffs is where we would really see the first signs of total defensive exploitation. Chris Middleton is a guy you could routinely go to on the wing or mid-post and got efficient looks on 3 levels. And he destroyed his Duncan Robinson matchup every chance he got, with 21 a game on near 50-40-90 in a 4-0 sweep. Robinson would only see his playing time decrease from 36 minutes all the way down to 15, as he was clearly unplayable. Nonetheless, defensive issues and all, Miami threw the bag at him mostly due to his role on the squad that almost got the job done in 2020. But this, of course, is when Duncan Robinson would steeply decline. At 10.9 a game on 40% and 37% shooting splits, with a declining role on the team that was a game away from another finals run, as teammate Max Strus emerged as a legitimate 3-and-D guy rather than just a 3-point specialist, he took Robinson's spot come playoff time, to where this $90 million man was catching DNPs in the playoffs. The problems would only get worse, as Robinson's production fell to a miserable 6 points per game on 37% shooting and 33% from 3, as the season would be shortened by injury, including an injury to a shooting hand finger that he states had been bothering him for quite some time. This was a major low point. Robinson was out of the Heat's rotation despite making $250,000 a game. From the heights he reached in 2020, it seemed like a night and day difference from his reality. What in the world could have caused this? Well, to get the obvious out of the way, the physical limitations to your shooting hand finger probably played a part, to the extent of which I don't really know, but the more you listen to him, the answer seems to become a bit more clear. When his play began declining, unlike Podcast P, this dude did the right thing and got his ass off his podcast, but not before he gave us a few answers. Robinson is one of those guys who rides confidence highs and lows to the skies or the floor. When things are going poorly, it only gets worse. But when things were up, he felt like the man. At a time when the 2020 Heat were a bit desperate for scoring, Spo would get a bit creative to get more out of a player with Robinson's skill set than almost any other coach would have been able to get. With plays being written up with the objective of launching Robinson 3 balls routinely throughout deep playoff runs, this guy's confidence hit all-time highs, to where he had one of the most efficient shooting seasons in NBA history. That feat isn't incredibly impressive, no matter how you want to put it. But when holes in his game began to shine through, and Duncan wasn't able to rely on Bam Adebayo's space and playmaking to routinely generate him open 3 balls, while defensively he was being targeted, there was nowhere to hide the one-dimensional aspect of his game, and the Heat had to shift their system him away from Duncan Robinson's magical run. Teams in a way kind of figured him out, and at that point, he had to retreat onto the bench for 2 seasons while his play significantly declined. It wasn't until the next season that we saw Duncan Robinson climb back into the Heat's rotation and began to ramp up his production close to what it was at 13 a game on just under 40% from deep. But really, a major factor for why this is due to the fact that he works so hard on his slashing and more so on his facilitating, to where now he's actually very viable at his position. I mean, I'm glad that Robinson worked his way back into the rotation here and all that, and he still does have one of the most intriguing journeys to the league, and I do wish the best for him and all of that. But after signing that contract, there was a very steep and very clear decline in his play that's hard to deny. I'm not trying to knock him here. In fact, it's actually pretty commendable to climb out of this slump the way that he did, but for a league that seems to value shooting more than anything and everything, Duncan Robinson was an interesting case study that proves this surely isn't always the only thing that matters. Personally, I kinda hate seeing star players in jerseys other than the one that became known. Miss me with that Ewing on the Magic or Olajuwon on the Raptors BS, but very few were as ugly as Big Ben Wallace in a Chicago Bulls jersey. This dude was just such an embodiment for a Detroit Pistons squad. That is someone with no ties or bias to Detroit whatsoever, with just one of the most special ball clubs that the game's ever seen. It certainly wasn't great to see that after the failed attempts to repeat on another championship run, Wallace would leave the team and the system that did so much for him to join the rival Chicago Bulls. I'm not knocking him per se, but to receive boos in his own arena in Detroit, just to later come back when on his last legs, this signing really didn't make any sense if not for the overpayment that they gave him, because after this signing, Wallace's career and the Detroit Pistons championship run were both basically over. Now I don't know about you guys, but I really couldn't name a single defender I've seen in my life that was better than Big Ben. He was the anchor of all anchors, and playing in the Eastern Conference against LeBron James, now without your rim protector, who just won his 4th Defensive Player of the Year award, softened their defense to where they were no longer competitive. Wallace, on the other hand, was asked to do a bit too much over in Chicago. The $60 million they gave him was a lot, in that first year dragging them from 41 wins with the 7th ranked defense to 49 wins with the best defense was great, but this did not last forever. Just 1 season later, and Ben Wallace was by far the worst offensive player in the NBA. Honestly, one of the worst ever. I mean, 39% from the field and 42% from the line. I don't really know how he managed to never improve as an offensive player, but while in Detroit, they had a much easier time hiding him and letting him serve his role anchoring an already very good defense and hustling on the offensive glass to serve some sort of offensive purpose. Outside of the system in Chicago and eventually Cleveland that didn't really have the ability to hide his offensive weaknesses, or really more so hide the fact that his offense was an entire weakness, but with his age getting up there and injuries having racked up, the unhuman levels of athleticism that elevated him to all-time great defensive levels as a 6'7" center steeply declined, as he fell from the very best to just a very good defensive player as his career wrapped up. Chicago shouldn't have given him this kind of money, and I kinda wish he wouldn't have taken it, although you can't really knock him. But due to his play declining after the contract that was kind of his reward for his hard work over the years, it was a rather ugly finish to an otherwise brilliant career. In July 2008, Gilbert Arenas signed a 6-year contract with $111 million with the Washington Wizards, a massive deal that in hindsight turned into one of the worst contracts in NBA history. When at his best, there was really very few players who have ever reached the level of Gilbert Arenas as a scorer. This guy was one of the most entertaining players that the game's ever seen, peaking at around 30 points per game with the Washington Wizards. I mean, personally, I think Gilbert is a bit underrated all time. His peak was crazy high, and although he wasn't always scoring the most efficiently, had Arenas gotten some more talent around him, and had he been available to play more often, Arenas may be remembered as one of the greats of the era. However, just a year prior to signing his contract, he suffered a devastating knee injury when Gerald Wallace crashed into him, tearing his MCL. What made the situation even more puzzling was the unusually long recovery time. A torn MCL typically heals within 6 weeks or so, and most players are able to return in 3 to 4 months tops. Yet, Arenas struggled to make it back, managing to play only 13 games in the entire 2007-2008 season. Rumors started to circulate that his knee surgery had been botched, leading to doubts about whether he would ever regain his former explosiveness. Despite these concerns, the Wizards found themselves in a difficult position. Arenas was the face of their franchise, and had carried them to multiple playoff appearances, and turned them into a respectable team after years of mediocrity at best. Letting him walk away in free agency would have been a tough pill to swallow for both the front office and the fan base. However, signing him to a massive long-term deal without fully understanding the extent of his injury was a major gamble. Ultimately, they chose to bet on his past performance rather than his current health, a decision that would very soon haunt them. After signing the deal, Arenas struggled to stay on the court. The explosiveness and quick first step that made him so dangerous seemed to be gone completely, and really just hindered where he stood in the NBA. His knee issues lingered, and he was never able to return to his all-star form. The situation worsened in 2009 when he became became embroiled in one of the most infamous off-court incidents in NBA history. A dispute with teammate Javaris Crittenton over a gambling debt escalated to the point where both players brought guns into the Wizards' locker room. The scandal resulted in a suspension for Arenas, further derailing his career. By the time he returned to action, he was kinda ass. The Wizards, realizing their mistake, traded him to the Magic in 2010, but his decline continued. He bounced around briefly, playing limited minutes for Orlando before an unsuccessful stint with the Memphis Grizzlies. Just a few years after signing that massive deal, Arenas was completely out of the NBA for good. What was once one of the most promising careers in the NBA had collapsed in dramatic fashion. Arenas went from being a 30-point per game superstar to an afterthought, undone by injuries, off-court issues, and a contract that became one of the biggest financial burdens in league history. Gilbert's a bit of a head case, and given his current persona, it is kinda hard and a bit funny to think back at how his career unfolded. Although more memorable for his off-court theatrics, his quickness with the ball made him one of the best volume scorers in the NBA for a quick while before injury was a real killer to his all-star level play. The Joakim Noah signing might go down as one of the worst free agent deals in New York Knicks history, and considering it was the Knicks making the move, that's really saying something. When Phil Jackson gave Noah a 4-year, $72 million contract in the summer of 2016, the idea was to reunite him with Derrick Rose and recreate some of the magic that they had in Chicago. But anyone paying attention could see this was destined for failure from the start. By the time Noah signed with New York, he was already a shell of the player who had won Defensive Player of the Year in 2014 and finished 4th in MVP voting that same season. His energy, defense, and playmaking from the center position had made him a perfect fit for Tom Thibodeau's system, but those days were long gone. He had just come off a season where he averaged 4.3 points and 8.8 rebounds in 29 games before undergoing major shoulder surgery. A team with even the slightest competence would have recognized the red flags, but the Knicks, being the Knicks, thought they were buying low on an impact player instead of handing out a massive payday to a washed-up center with a body that was clearly breaking down. I mean, trying to rebuild D. Rose and Noah after an array of injuries just felt like a team that was more interested in the intention it would bring them and their aesthetic from outside the league rather than building the most competitive roster that they could. The disaster began immediately. Noah was already declining athletically, and whatever he had left in the tank was completely drained by injuries. In his first season with the Knicks, he played in only 46 games, averaging a measly 5 points and 8.8 rebounds while shooting 43% from the free throw line. He was suspended 20 games for violating the NBA's anti-drug policy after testing positive for juice, and by the time he returned, he was barely in the rotation. Things only got worse from there. In year 2, Noah played just 7 games before the Knicks completely gave up on him. His role had already been reduced to nothing. Offensively, this guy was one of the worst players in the league, and defensively, he was nowhere close to what he was in Chicago. But a heated altercation with coach Jeff Hornacek in January 2018 sealed his fate. Reports said Noah was furious about his lack of playing time and got into a shouting match with Hornacek during a practice on a West Coast trip. Things got so heated that the two had to be separated, and the Knicks basically exiled Noah from the team afterward. He never played another game for the franchise for that point out. At that point, the only question was how the Knicks could get rid of him. They desperately tried to negotiate a buyout, but Noah, knowing there was no chance he'd get anywhere close to that money again, refused to leave a single dollar on the table. That forced New York to waive him using the stretch provision, meaning they had to keep paying him even after he was gone. The Knicks ended up paying Noah through 2022, 2 years after he had last touched an NBA floor. The contract was an all-time disaster. What makes it even worse is how avoidable it was. Noah was clearly fucking washed before the Knicks signed him, and yet they still gave him $72 million, a contract that instantly became untradeable and instantly was recognized as a total boneheaded move. I mean, I don't even see the loudest of you Knicks fans hopeful about his signing. He played a grand total of 53 games for the team, and when you factor in his suspension, injuries, and locker room drama, it's hard to think of a worse free agent signing. Now, Noah at his best was one extremely interesting player with a decline that was really as boring as it gets, and ruined his reputation quite a bit as well. But Hassan Whiteside seemed to have one of the most mysterious falls in the NBA. Now, Hassan Whiteside was kind of freaking weird, because he was a mix of things that you really don't see too often. He was overlooked and underscouted despite being a freak of an athlete with all-time great defensive potential. As a second-round pick, given really no chance with the Kings, before playing in China in the D-League for 2 years, Hassan Whiteside had one unique jersey before getting an opportunity with the Miami Heat. But when given that opportunity, Whiteside put up some very loud numbers. Immediately, this guy was putting up a double-double with over 2.5 blocks per game. I remember this year pretty clearly, actually. He was kind of shocking the NBA, putting up triple-doubles with blocks, then telling reporters he was just focused on getting his 2K rating up. It was an incredibly exciting brand of basketball. He was shooting over 60%, primarily as Goran Dragic's lob threats, In his second year with the Heat, he was swatting a crazy 3.7 blocks per game, and after signing a max in 2016, Whiteside was putting up a crazy 17 and 14 a night. Now this sounds crazy for a guy who kind of fit that role as an energy guy who grinded his way into the NBA, but really, that wasn't even close to Hassan Whiteside. In reality, I'm sorry to tell you, but Hassan Whiteside at his best was not a max player. He wasn't really an energy player, and he really wasn't a great player or defender, which the basic stats don't tell you. But this is a realization that the Miami Heat organization and the fan base had to make the hard way. These stats were really as empty as it gets. Hassan Whiteside was a block chaser who was very easy to get out of position with a basic up fake. And as the Heat got more options at the center position, they quickly realized that a Hassan Whiteside anchored defense was a pretty bad defense. Other than extreme athleticism, Whiteside's game was pretty limited by his IQ, and although having made it from the bottom to the top, he really wasn't Mr. Hustle either. After being maxed by the Heat, his minutes fell from 32 to 23 over the next 2 years, as the league kind of realized that in terms of guarding pick and rolls and actually contesting shots at the basket in a way that lowers shooting percentages over an extended period of time, Hassan Whiteside was quite bad. These stats were as empty as it gets, man. And due to having all the tools to actually reach the top in these areas, his exciting play kind of tricked us all, the Miami Heat included. It's a bit ironic the way he exited. After dropping from 17 and 14 to 12 and 11, when age-wise he was supposed to be entering his absolute prime, Whiteside was replaced by Bam Adebayo, a smaller center who managed to become one of the best defenders at his position without being a real shot-blocking threat, just based on his effort, switchability, and defensive IQ. The anti-Whiteside, if you will. I don't hate Whiteside, I know it may kind of sound like it, but for a guy like this, I appreciate what he was while also acknowledging that he really didn't come close to what he could be, and it wasn't until after the max money that the league realized that as well. The summer of 2016 was one of the wildest free agency periods in NBA history. Thanks to the massive salary cap spike caused by the league's new TV deal, teams suddenly had way more money to spend than usual. Instead of being patient and making smart moves, most front offices just lost their mind, throwing insane contracts at average or injury-prone players. This was the offseason where Luol Deng got 72 mil, Bismack Biyombo got 72, Mozgov got 64, and the list goes on and on. But even in that ridiculous spending spree, Chandler Parsons' contract stood out as one of the very worst. The Memphis Grizzlies gave Parsons a 4-year, $94 million deal, which was immediately mocked by fans and analysts alike. I mean, $94 million fucking dollars. While Parsons showed flashes of being a quality wing player in Houston and Dallas, he was far, far from a star. His injury history should have been a major red flag. He was coming off 2 shaky seasons with the Mavericks, where he averaged 14.8 points in 2015 and 13.7 points in 2016. But more importantly, he was already dealing with major knee issues. Right before free agency, he had undergone a 3rd knee surgery, yet somehow, the Grizzlies still believed he was worth near a max deal. It didn't take long for the deal to blow up in their faces. Parsons' knee problems never went away, and his body simply couldn't hold up. In his first year with Memphis, he played 34 games, averaging 6 points on 34% shooting. He struggled to move laterally, lost his explosiveness, and couldn't stay on the floor. The next season, he played 36 games, and the year after that, just 25. By year 3, it was clear that the Grizzlies were desperate to get rid of him, but his contract was so bad that no team would touch it with a 10-meter stick. Finally, in 2019, they managed to dump his contract onto the Atlanta Hawks, who weren't actually planning on using him as a player, just as a salary filler. He played a grand total of 5 games for the Hawks in his final season before suffering a career-ending car accident, which further derailed any hopes of an NBA comeback. What made things worse was that in the games he did play, he was a shell of his former self. The guy who had a smooth offensive game and could score at all 3 levels had now become an inefficient role player with no explosion. His stats plummeted every year, and by the time his contract was up, no NBA team had thought about him in years. While it's easy to clown the Grizzlies for giving him that fat contract, and Parsons gets a lot of flack as well, Parsons might have been unfairly criticized. It wasn't like he got paid and suddenly became lazy. His knee issues were seriously crippling, and it just got worse with time. But that didn't stop fans from roasting him throughout his tenure. At one point, there's a viral stat claiming he had more Instagram posts than games played for the Grizzlies, which basically summed up his time there. The Chandler Parsons deal will always be remembered as one of the worst contracts in NBA history, and while he wasn't the only player to cash in during that wild 2016 free agency, his deal aged worse than almost anyone else's. John Wall's 4-year, $171 Supermax, signed in 2017, ended up being one of the most disastrous contracts in NBA history, not necessarily because of his play, but because of injuries, and bad luck completely derailing his otherwise brilliant career. By the time the extension even kicked in during the 2019-2020 season, Wall had already started missing significant time. deadline. What followed was an unprecedented level of inactivity for a player making such ludicrous amounts of money. Wall missed the entirety of the 2019-2020 season due to ruptured Achilles tendon, an injury he suffered in one of the most unfortunate ways possible, slipping in his own house. That injury alone would have been devastating, but for a player whose game was built on insane speed, explosiveness, and athleticism, it was especially brutal to the future of his career. Achilles injuries have been a death sentence for many NBA players, and Wall was really no exception. By the time he returned for the 2020-2021 season, the Wizards had already moved on, trading him to the Houston Rockets for Russell Westbrook in what was essentially a swap of two bloated contracts. Wall played 40 games that season, averaging 20 points and 7 assists, but he was on an inefficient 40% from the field and 31% from 3, and he clearly wasn't the same player that he once was. Even worse, the Rockets were one of the worst teams in the NBA, so those games didn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. Then came one of the strangest chapters of Wall's career. He sat out the entire 2021-22 season despite being completely healthy. The Rockets were deep into a rebuild and wanted to prioritize developing their young players, while Wall still believed he could be a starting caliber point guard. The two sides couldn't agree on a role, and rather than playing limited minutes or coming off the bench, Wall and the Rockets mutually agreed he'd sit out until a trade was found. The problem, no team wanted this massive contract. At one point, rumors swirled about another Wall for Westbrook swap, this time with the Lakers. Clutch Sports reportedly tried to pressure the Lakers into making the move, but it never materialized. The trade deadline passed, and Wall was still rotting on Houston's bench without playing a single game. Eventually, the Rockets had no choice but to buy him out in the summer of 2022, ending his disastrous tenure there. Wall then signed a one-year deal with the Clippers, but by that point, he was just a shell of his former self after only playing 34 games for LA and struggling with his efficiency. He was traded back to Houston at the 2023 deadlines, only to be waived immediately. In the end, Wall's Supermax contract paid him $171 million over 4 years, during which he only played 40 games that actually mattered. That's $4.25 million per game played on the extension. Even though Wall's downfall wasn't entirely his fault, since injuries were the main reason, it still ranks in as one of the worst contracts in NBA history. What makes it even sadder is when at his peak, Wall was one of the most electrifying point guards in the league, but thanks to a mix of injuries and bad luck, he never even got to see the prime years of his Supermax deal. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed. We're trying to hit 100,000 this year. I appreciate you all watching, and as always, I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.